When did the Latin spoken on the Iberian Peninsula stop being Latin and become Spanish? And what did early Spanish look and sound like? Welcome to Jack of All Languages. My name is Jack, and today I'm going to attempt to answer some of these questions. In today's episode, we're going to look at 3 historical documents written between the 10th and the 13th centuries, all of which were written in languages that were Spanish-ish. That is, these documents aren't yet Castilian Spanish, but they represent the transition from late Latin to Iberian Romance to modern Spanish. This video is part 2 in my series on the transition from Latin to Spanish. In last week's video, I looked at how Latin got to Spain and what variety of Latin they were speaking in the Iberian Peninsula during Roman times. You might find that video interesting, so go check it out if you want more context on this topic, but you definitely don't have to see that video in order to understand what I'm talking about today. So let's get started on today's topic. If you saw my last video, you know that Latin was brought to Spain by 206 BCE when the Romans defeated the Carthaginians in the Second Punic War. So by that point, people were starting to speak some variety of Latin in Spain. And Latin continued to grow and gain prominence, and so people were speaking Latin in Spain all the way through the times of the Roman Empire to the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE. After that, there was a bit of a power vacuum. And eventually the Visigoths from southern France moved into Spain, and they consolidated their power in central Spain around the city of Toledo. The Visigoths were a Germanic tribe, but they had actually adopted Latin to a large degree, definitely in their official documents and possibly even in their day-to-day speech. For this reason, there's not a ton of Visigothic influence on the modern Spanish language. So that's the political environment that Spain, or Hispania, finds itself in by the end of the Western Roman Empire. And at this point, in the 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries, they're still speaking what they consider to be Latin. But by now, their version of Latin is pretty different from classical Latin. But it was not clearly Spanish by this point either, so a lot of scholars refer to the transitional languages from this time period as Romance. So let's look at some historical documents that historians and archaeologists have found in Spain. These are going to give us some exciting clues about the development of the Spanish language and what Spanish or Romance looked like in between Latin and modern Spanish. First up is the 10th century Nodicia de kesos. This is a fascinating document and a personal favorite of mine because all it is a list of cheeses. Yep, you heard me right. It is a list of cheeses written down by some monks at a monastery in the modern-day province of León in northwestern Spain. I'll read a little bit from the document. Nodicia de kesos que aspicit frater semeno, in labore de fratres, in illo bacellare de circa sante juste, kesos 5, in illo alio de apate, 2 kesos, in que puseron ogano, kesos 4. Here I'm showing you translations into modern English and modern Spanish, so pause the video for a second if you want to read through these, but I'll just read that same section I just read in modern Spanish to give you a comparison. Relación de los quesos que gastó el hermano Jimeno en el trabajo de los frailes en la viña nueva de cerca de San Justo, 5 quesos. En el otro del abad, 2 quesos. En el que pusieron ogaño, 4 quesos. Some scholars have actually made the claim that this document, with its date of 980, marks the very beginning of the Spanish language. Well, it certainly is among the oldest written documents in a Spanish language, that is, a Romance dialect spoken in the country we now call Spain. But does that mean it deserves the title of the beginning or the cradle of the Spanish language? José Ramon Morala, a professor of Hispanic philology at the University of León, tells us no. Because languages aren't born at one point in time. They develop and change over time, sometimes slowly, sometimes more quickly, but never in such a way that we can mark the end of one language like Latin and the beginning of another language like Spanish. And anyone who wants to claim that a document like this marks the beginning of the Spanish language, Morala tells us, probably has an economic or a political motive for saying so. On top of that, the Nodicia de kesos isn't even written in Castilian Spanish. Having been written near modern León, the language of the document is probably closer to the set of languages known as Astur-Leonese, a language family still spoken in northwestern Spain today. But the Nodicia de kesos isn't Leonese either. Morala tells us that it's a variety of Romance that comes before Leonese and Castilian. Okay, with all that out of the way, let's now take a look at the language of the document. What can this list of cheeses tell us about the variety of Romance that was being spoken in Spain in the 10th century? First off, we already see a lot of modern Spanish vocabulary in this document. We see quesos instead of the Latin caseum, mesa instead of the Latin mensa, torre instead of the Latin turim. And these words are very similar, if not identical, to their modern Spanish versions. We also see the use of the definite articles ilo and illa corresponding to the English word the. Latin didn't have definite articles, but Romance languages took their definite articles from Latin demonstrative pronouns like this and that. That's exactly where ilo and illa come from, and these words eventually become el and la in modern Spanish. So, in la viña mayore from the Nodicia becomes in la viña mayor in modern Spanish. There are some other lexical and grammatical shifts typical of the transition from Latin to Romance in this text, such as the disappearance of the Latin case system. But we'll go ahead and move on to our next text, and we'll see some of the same kinds of changes there. Next, we have the Glosas Emilianenses, or the San Millán glosses, written sometime in the 10th or 11th century. This is another fascinating set of documents, and what they are is a set of manuscripts originally written in Latin, with notes in the margins in 3 different languages. These languages are a more simplified version of Latin, Basque, and an early variety of Romance. And these glosses or notes would have likely helped the scribes to understand what the Latin text was saying. The glosses were most likely written at the monastery of San Millán de la Cogolla in the modern region of La Rioja. And the variety of Romance we see in these documents again is not Castilian, but a Riojan variety of Spanish, which likely died out a few centuries later once Castilian became the standard variety of Spanish. Like the Nodicia de Kesos, the glosses offer a fascinating glimpse into early Spanish, and there's one gloss in particular that I want to show you, Gloss 89. Gloss 89 is unique among the glosses in that it's not just a few notes scribbled here and there in the margin, but it's actually a complete translation of a small prayer. Here's what Gloss 89 says. Con aiutorio de nuestro dueño Cristo, dueño Salvatore, qual dueño yet in honore, e qual dueño tienet e la mandazione, con o Padre, con o Spiritu Santo, en los séculos de los séculos. Facanus Deus omnipotens tal servitio fere, que dinante a la sua face gaudioso seamus. Amen. And here again are some modern translations into English and Spanish, so pause the video here for a second if you want to read through these. What's amazing about this text is it sounds a lot like modern Spanish, and some of the changes we see from Latin are the same we saw in the Nodicia de Kesos. The loss of the Latin case system, for example, and its replacement by prepositions, or the use of, in this case, ella and o as definite articles. We also see that by this point, Spanish had lost the distinction between the B and the V sounds, seen here in the word Salvatore, written with a B. Scholars don't agree on an exact date for these glosses, but they were probably written something like 50 to 100 years after the Nodicia de Kesos. So what we see here is another stage in the transition from late Latin to Romance to eventually early Spanish. And at this point, we're getting really close to what you could reasonably call the Spanish language. I mean, if you speak Spanish, you could probably understand a good bit of what I just read from Gloss 89. Okay, on to our last set of documents, and these are the Valpuesta Cartularies. The Cartularies are a set of 187 legal documents, mostly involving the sale or the donation of land. And these were written near modern Burgos between the 9th and the 13th centuries, so the earliest of these actually come before our last 2 documents, but the later ones are well after. And since these texts cover such a long period, they give us a great look into the evolution of Spanish over these centuries. In the earliest documents from the Valpuesta Cartularies, we see just a few features of an emerging distinct Spanish language. But by the time we get to the 10th, 11th, and 12th century documents, we have a language that is clearly not Latin, and it's clearly early Spanish by this point. In these texts, we see some typical characteristics of the Spanish language, including diphthongization of words like cuenca from Latin conca, puero from Latin coriu, and fuero from Latin foru. We also see palatalization, a sound change where consonants start to be pronounced closer to the front of the mouth, in words like consello from Latin concilium, and maguelo from Latin maleolu. This has just been a very, very basic overview of some of the earliest written documents in Spanish. We could say so much more about these documents, and there's so many more documents we could talk about as well, but hopefully this has been a fun introduction to this subject. These 3 documents, the Nodicia de Kesos, the San Millán glosses, and the Valpuesta Cartularies, give us more than just a little glimpse, but really a pretty expansive view of the transition from late Latin to early Romance and early Spanish, which of course did not happen overnight and almost certainly went unnoticed by the common people speaking these languages. Even in the 11th century, when we have a pretty Spanish-sounding language being spoken in León, ordinary people still probably thought they were speaking Latin. And in a way, they were. All languages have different registers, the different varieties of speech spoken by different people in different social classes or in different geographical settings or in different time periods. So while the monks and the priests and the bureaucrats and officials may have been speaking something a little bit closer to classical or standard Latin, the common people were speaking in a different register, something very different from church Latin. Just like how in English we have the speech that we use every day with our families and friends in casual settings, and then we have the speech that we use in more formal settings like giving a lecture or reading a legal document, which really seem like two different languages, but we call both of them English. So when did Latin stop being Latin and become Spanish? Well, by now you probably see that that's not only an impossible question to answer, but also the wrong question to ask. But thanks to historical evidence like the documents we saw today, we do have a good idea of what the languages of the long transitional period between Latin and Spanish sounded like. Thank you for watching Jack of All Languages. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that subscribe button. It's a big help to me as I continue this early phase of building this YouTube channel. I definitely want to keep making videos, but I need your help. And liking, subscribing, and sharing is a really easy way to do that. Thanks so much, and see you all next time.